Ja, guten Tag.
Good morning.
Mein Name ist Edith Kresta.
My name is Edith
Ich freue mich sehr,
Kresta.
heute hier sprechen zu dürfen.
I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you here this morning because this really is an historical occasion for me. I studied at the Free University here in Berlin and experienced Rudi Dutschke here. The lecture hall was a bit fuller on that occasion than it was this morning, but there was another difference too. There weren't that many women speaking at that occasion. Basically, only men gave lectures at that stage, and therefore I'm very grateful to you for inviting me along to speak to you this morning because, and I think we just heard that in Mr. Kuhlfeld's presentation quite clearly, that travel is male. From Herodot to Bruce Chatwin, all those who have talked to us about what travel means have been men. Therefore, thanks very much again for inviting me along as a travel journalist from Taz, who's out about a little bit, to talk to you here this morning. Now, I don't want to deal so much with the theoretical aspects of travel, to a certain extent, yes, but I'd like to focus more on the social and sustainability aspects of travel. So what to do now is to focus more on the present in social and political terms. I've produced 10 propositions to this end, which I'd like to read to you now. Consumerism, not communism, I've just talked of Rudi Dutschke. Consumerism has asserted itself. Consumerism is the prevalent attitude in the world. Hannah, a senior school teacher, goes on at least one long-distance journey a year, along with a number of other smaller trips during the shorter school holidays. But that was only the start of her unbridled wanderlust. Since her retirement, as I said, she was a senior school teacher, there is no stopping her anymore. She's been to India, Iceland, Iran, Bali, Thailand, Morocco, Turkey, Israel, and Vietnam. In order to recollect what she's seen and experienced, she produces scores of photos, apart from which she sets great store by tasteful souvenirs, exotic clothing, or unusual household items. And with her store of photo material, she could spend thousands of hours giving slide lectures. Now, if her fellow teachers, Ulrike and Norbert, as a green activist and a trade union functionary, were to join here, and after all, these two go on at least 3 long-term journeys a year, they could spend the last years of their lives just living in photo worlds without ever setting a foot outside the door. So there really is no journey that makes you happy in the end, that provides you with peace and quiet. We're not talking here about happiness. What we do is buy more often and ever more quickly a journey, a tour, and think that we're buying something that really isn't purchasable at the end of the day. Nothing strikes us being more absurd than the question about why we indulge in these instant trips. Which brings me on to my second proposition, that acceleration rules the world, as Mr. Kuhlfeld mentioned in his lecture as well. Now, we do what money does, and we just race around the world. We surf from horizon to horizon, always on the surface without any sense of depth whatsoever. We buy neatly packaged worlds where we're taken off by very experienced guides and globalized organizers. Journeys that are purged of all effort and any uncertainty. Since industrialization, the world has shrunk to 1/60th of its original size, at least in arithmetical terms. If you relate the modern transport speeds of goods and people to the distances that are covered. And that's the way things are perceived too, as having shrunk. Today, you talk about flight hours when really you mean distances. In the post-war period, holidaymakers were able to go about their leisurely summer break and more or less had the feeling that they were spending the most precious weeks of the year on Mediterranean beaches and were able to enjoy the achievements of the working people, but we no longer leave anything to chance whatsoever. It's long since the case that the mad race has become the subject of research carried out by social scientists. And the question is here whether the racing standstill, to quote Paul Virilio, has already been achieved. The person who is leading in this debate on the diagnosis of our times is Hartmut Rosa. His bulky study explains acceleration as a fundamental structural trend of the modern era. The effects of the dynamic cycle, consisting of economics, technology, and culture, is readily described in a plausible manner as follows. And this is what he says. The liquefaction process, whose logic we already practice, lets nobody escape. Slipping slopes is how Rosa characterizes the uncertain ground on which postmodern individuals move. Now, this is an uncertainty that increasingly generates fear. The fear of being left behind by the community of the dynamic, the mobile, and the cosmopolitan people, and being compulsory decelerated in the direction of the OAPs, the backward people, the immobile people. So the racers fear, they dread any standstill, and once they've reached their personal limits, they would rather flee into a burnout or a depression, our modern-day disease, than to consciously decelerate their lives. And need a bit of deceleration as well. Acceleration and consumerism have entered a very close relationship in tourism. The economy only really buzzes if sufficient numbers of products are bought. Cycling may now be a modern social trend, but it only really becomes significant if you fly to Vietnam to ride around there. Meditation may be en vogue as well, but you only really experience it in an authentic manner if you go to Bali. So travel has become a question of social status. And it's only the real, the enhanced product that makes modern people feel important. And who doesn't want to feel important after all? Tourism claims that it can offer us those sensations, feelings, the authenticity, the sense of belonging that we feel that we lacked in our ordinary everyday lives. So every travel package that is sold to a customer is also a ticket which gives us the right profile for our modern, rapid, dynamic society. We become global wallies rather than globe trotters. On now to my fourth proposition. Now, I'm of an age when tourism was part and parcel of the struggle against industrialization. So the criticism of tourism today is now outdated. Doesn't really make any progress. Well, it doesn't really exist. It does occur to a certain extent, but well, I'll come on to that in just a moment. Now, carping about tourists has always been de rigueur among elites who like to scoff at the mass-like character of the lower classes. But with the arrival of the alternative movement, a new manner of speaking arose. The critics of the 1970s and 80s regarded tourists as dull and somewhat stupid culprits, trampling around on untouched landscapes or on the feelings of the locals. The tourists were also regarded as victims, as people who'd been seduced by industry, who had readily believed the advertising messages of the scent of the great wide world, and yet when they were there, only experienced things that proved to be tasteless. So tourism was now perceived as an industry, just like any other, which causes colossal environmental damage. You'll be familiar with that from the discussion about the Spanish beaches, or the Costa Blanca, the whole of the Mediterranean coast, which at this time experienced a vast amount of growth as a result of tourism. In the meantime, there are critical voices who criticize the effect on the climate and the use of resources, although, of course, that is still an aspect of criticism. Essentially now it is the basic aspect of any criticism of tourism. We're talking here about sustainability. Sustainability has now arrived at the very center of society. So sensitive, eco-conscious, middle-class people who read my newspaper, the Tats, respond to this with attempts that resemble a selling of indulgences, for instance, with a CO2 charge for flying, given that they're prepared to stretch a point with regard to their holiday and just simply ignore the ecological footprint. But nonetheless, the quality, that is my proposition 5, the quality discussion, by that I mean the sustainability discussion, now forms part and parcel of the tourist trade. So, as is the case with the drinking and eating, we're talking here about a good, properly cleansed product. There are travel organizers who have written intensity, encounter, and deceleration very large, and then sell this in the very expensive category of what they have to offer. And in the tourist industry too, the world has got round that artistic worlds of the kind that were popular back in the 1960s or on into the 1970s and 80s are kitschy and ultimately boring. So artificial worlds are now filled, wherever that is possible, with, inverted commas, genuine life. There's a village in Toscana run by TUI that has been carefully built up, and old people are taken there. The shops are put up there, baker shops and so on and so forth, to create the impression in this village of a living cosmos. But there are also tourist companies that bank on fair travel and social responsibility. They also discuss sustainability and future viability as issues. Alternative organizers, Petra Thomas will be talking this afternoon to you about this. And here the quality discussion is not limited just to expensive, sophisticated trips. And this travel market in particular has become very, very varied indeed. It ranges from climbing to courses in photography to seminars on philosophy. And there are also an increasing number of narratives, which often end up in the bestseller charts, and talk about the deep felt satisfaction that can be drawn from slow travel. I think this is what Mr. Kufert was referring to in a different modern form. So, slow travel, we're talking about here intimate contact with reality, about the search for happiness. We're talking here about flow. Time for erotic adventures, time for contemplation, and time for adventures that can take the form of experience that is gathered. So it's no surprise that amongst the travellers there are many fans of esotericism. For instance, the pilgrims on St. James' Way, like Paulo Coelho, Sonny McLean, and last but by no means least, our comedian Harper Kerkeling. Their proximity to the sacred time, inverted commas, makes them appear in charge of things as compared to the fast and hectic pace of modern life. And let me now quote Hartmut Rosa here again at this point. The only people who currently have a convincing concept for deceleration are the Taliban. Do we really want to leave the issue of deceleration up to adherents of religion? of whatever hue, or would it not perhaps be better to accelerate discussion about fair forms of travel, about a different, more sustainable form of travel? Which I come on now to an outlook to what I think has developed in the context of social movements and other aspects in Germany. A step in the right direction towards an ethics in tourism is the tourist seal of corporate responsibility. Under the heading of corporate social responsibility, CSR, the organization Tourismus, which has headquarters in Stuttgart, certifies companies on the basis of a very strict certification procedure for the responsibility that they show in tourism. That includes human rights, by the way. 64 German tourist companies have already been awarded this quality seal, and that includes, by way of major exception, a major Swiss organizer. All aspects of the value-added chain of a travel organizer are examined right down to the business headquarters. So the seal of corporate responsibility does not evaluate a single product, but the entire sustainability performance of a tourist company. So that means the companies have to take a critical look at their entire service chain. What are the working conditions like? Do the hotels, restaurants and transport firms pay appropriate wages on the spot in Tunisia, Morocco, Bali, or wherever it might be? What are the labor contracts like? Are trade unions permitted? Do they work actively for the protection of children against abuse? You'll know that in many countries in the third world, or the southern hemisphere, as you say today, Thailand, Cambodia, child prostitution is a major problem. So does that business help to foster democratic structures in these countries? Have the locals any chance of benefiting from this product, or is it the case, as so often in tourism in industrialized countries, that everything that is earned is transferred back to the parent company? Now, this certification presumes social and ecological standards. Now, this is particularly important in a sector of the economy which advertises the fine aspects of nature and encounter. On now to my seventh proposition. This involvement on the part of the travel organizers is certainly part of their social responsibility, but at the end of the day, quality pays off. Certification sharpens the awareness of one's own company. It reduces environmental costs and increases the degree of satisfaction amongst the employees and therefore the overall quality of the product concerned. Certification is thus an in-company process of valorization. The majority of Germans welcome, according to surveys that have been carried out by research organizations in the tourist sector, efforts are made to protect the climate. According to the survey, 1 in 3 travelers would like to have ecological travel, but they don't actually do that because basically they're not prepared to change their own lifestyle, and certainly not when it comes to traveling. That applies to the hopefuls of green consumerism, these biologically oriented, socially aware middle-class people. In statistical terms, it is they who fly most, since every short-haul trip produces at least 200 kilograms of CO2 and every long-haul trip up to 4 tons of CO2. This is devastating blow for the eco-balance. No matter whether they travel by bike or a small car, use eco-electricity or whatever. And for most of these educated consumers, therefore, limit their personal commitment to paying the travel charge for fleeing. Now, this greenhouse gas compensation has the advantage that you don't actually need to change your travel behavior, neither when it comes to choosing where you want to go and how you want to get there. Otherwise, many people keep to the simple but straightforward formula. Better to have one long trip journey, but stay there for a longer period of time. Enjoy Bali with a good conscience by paying your emissions indulgence and staying there for at least 4 weeks. Now that sounds, if you like washing yourself without actually getting wet. But this also reveals a responsible approach to contradictions. The alternative would be to capitulate in the face of these contradictions, or simply just to not travel anymore at all. And after all, it's not wanderlust itself that is nasty. After all, the large number of developing countries that profit from our wanderlust. What is bad is that 2 weeks package trip to the Dominican Republic, including flight and board and lodging, is often cheaper than spending 2 weeks in the Black Forest here in Germany. Now, this is not by chance, given the predatory competition in the tourism industry, and cheap airlines are the benefactors of an erroneous mobility policy. But if most of the tourists base their decisions of where they're going on holiday on the money they have in their purse, they rather go to the Dominican Republic rather than go to the Black Forest, while the Maldives are sinking in the sea, then the responsibility of travel organizers and airlines are put back into focus. They have a responsibility that they must shoulder here. Which brings me on to my 8th proposition: more commercial ethics everywhere, including among the major tourist companies. However, the major tourist companies tend to overlook climate change almost completely. They explain their constantly increasing share of flight traffic is something they regard as a trifling matter. Their crisis awareness is limited to PR strategies of their advertising departments. They explain what image-boosting social and ecological projects are being supported, which wood is being reforested, and what schools are being financed. But what is Lufthansa, for example, doing to reduce its emissions of CO2? What low-emission offers are available from TUI? If tourist companies were to assume their responsibility for an intact environment from which they in particular draw profit, if they were to take that seriously, then they should realign their core business along social and ecological lines. Then a holiday, 2 weeks in Tunisia, where you only pay 400 euros now, that will no longer be possible in the future. You can only offer cheap prices by paying low wages to locals. Therefore, the companies should make it quite clear under what conditions a journey is organized and carried out. And they need to set themselves binding emission targets and develop the requisite instruments, methods and products by means of which a reduction could be achieved. My 9th proposition. Certified tourist companies can become the vanguard against global injustice and for the adherence to human rights. The CSR Quality Seal, Corporate Social Responsibility, is a long-term step towards greater quality and responsibility in tourism, towards more ethics. A very practical, concrete step. It sets new standards for the climate as well as for inner company fairness. And it eases the burden on the consumer, who doesn't really properly understand the value-added chain anyway. The world needs more such honest merchants who review their products on the basis of social and environmentally friendly criteria, above all in large-scale companies. And the World Tourism Organization, the WTO, which exists in the tourist trade, banks on the innovative strength of the tourist sector and appeals to the ecological and social responsibility of companies, to their corporate social responsibility. And even if it may appear to be a sweeping blow to call for just payment and more democracy in globally operating companies in connection with human rights, this is nonetheless the smallest common denominator. Most nations have now signed the Human Rights Convention, and as long as there are no rules or means of sanction for the global market in the form of an international organization, for instance within the confines of the UNO, the Corporate Social Responsibility Seal of Equality is a major step towards greater equality and responsibility in the realm of tourism. Which brings me on now to my final thesis, or proposition, is the ethics in tourism is a success of civil society. The discussion of social issues in the tourist sector, triggered by committed people, NGOs, and working in the realm of development cooperation and with the churches, has meant that the tourist industry, including the World Tourism Organization, have become more open towards issues of tourism that are seen through more critical eyes. In their Manila Declaration about the social consequences of tourism, the leading representatives of governments and tourist industry committed themselves in 1997 to the formulation of what was called a global code of ethics for tourism. And this was passed in 1999 by the General Assembly of the WTO. It contains 10 principles that concern themselves with the importance and responsibility of global tourism in accordance with a responsible and sustainable form of development. In order to foster, evaluate, and monitor the implementation of the code, the WTO set up a World Committee for Tourist Ethics with international representatives. The German Travel Association, DRV, and hitherto Germans have been world champions when it comes to travel. We've now been overtaken by the Chinese. The German Travel Association, DRV, only traveled this code, signed this code last year. So that was it. Thank you very much.